acts, felling the trees in the forest of the integrity of the court and the integrity of the Senate. So it sets the stage for all these battles that are going to come over future nominees. A pure partisanship, short-term gain, grudges to be remedied, rather than the advice and consent vision that was in our Constitution. The vision that Hamilton laid out would probably have to be used rarely because it would deter presidents from making nominations of people of unfit character. So I'm really disturbed about where we are headed. There's many policy issues that seem important at the time as they come from this floor, and they are important. They're issues related to the ability of workers to get fair wages for the value they bring to the development of their products they make. There's certainly key issues about our transportation infrastructure, key challenges on health care. But a single Supreme Court seat can change policy on a huge spectrum of issues, with the Supreme Court as the final arbiter. If we have a pivot point in which dark money, unlimited amounts of funds are injected into the national campaigns forevermore, well, we're never going to heal and get back to the point of the Senate being a great deliberative body, because that dark money will own this body and control this body much as it does now after the entry of the Koch brothers into the national campaign contests. So that's the impact of a single Supreme Court decision, but it has huge impact on who serves here and what decisions they make. It has huge impact on whether we are we the people government or government by and for the most powerful. Might be interesting at this point to go back in time to sections of a speech by Senator Robert Byrd. Senator Byrd was still here in the Senate when I came here in 2008. He was one of 4 senators that were in the Senate when I was an intern in 1976. So he says in this speech, delivered September 15th, 1998, in the old Senate chamber, "Cleo being my favorite muse, let me begin this evening with a look backward over the well-traveled road of history. History always turns our faces backward, and this is as it should be, so that we might be better informed and prepared to exercise wisdom in dealing with future events. To be ignorant of what happened before you were born," said Cicero, "is to remain always a child." So for a little while, as we meet together in this hallowed place, let us turn our faces backward. Look about you. We meet tonight in the Senate chamber, not the chamber in which we transact our business daily now, but the old Senate chamber, where our predecessors wrote the laws before the Civil War. Here in this room, Daniel Webster, he moved about the chamber from time to time. Daniel Webster orated. Henry Clay forged compromises. John C. Calhoun stood on principle. Here, Henry Foote of Mississippi pulled a pistol on Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri. Senator Benton ripped open his coat and said, "Let the assassin fire," and "Stand out of my way." Here, the eccentric Virginia Senator John Randolph brought his hunting dogs into the chamber. And the dashing Texas Senator Sam Houston sat over here to my right. He sat at his desk whittling wooden hearts for ladies in the gallery. Seated at his desk in the back row, Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner was beaten violently over the head with a cane wielded by Representative Preston Brooks of South Carolina, who objected to Sumner's strongly abolitionist speeches and the vituperation that Sumner had heaped upon Brooks' uncle, Senator Butler of South Carolina. The Senate first met here in 1810, but because our British cousins chose to set fire to the Capitol during the War of 1812, Congress was forced to move into the Patent Office Building in downtown Washington, and later into a building known as the Brick Capitol, located on the present site of the Supreme Court building. Hence, it was December 1819 before senators were able to return to this restored and elegant chamber. They met here for 40 years, and it was during that exhilarating period that the Senate experienced its golden age. Here in this room, the Senate tried to deal with the emotional and destructive issue of slavery by passing the Missouri Compromise of 1820. That act drew a line across the United States and asserted that the peculiar institution of slavery should remain to the south of the line and not spread to the north. The Missouri Compromise also set the precedent that for every slave state admitted to the Union, a free state should be admitted as well, and vice versa. What this meant in practical political terms was that the North and the South would be exactly equal in voting strength in this chamber, and that any settlement of the explosive issue of slavery would have to originate here in the Senate. As a result, the nation's most talented and ambitious legislators began to leave the House of Representatives to take seats here in the Senate chamber. Here, they fought to hold the Union together through the Omnibus Compromise of 1850, only to overturn these efforts by passing the fateful Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. The senators moved out of this room in 1859 on the eve of the Civil War, when they marched in procession from this chamber to the current chamber. It marked the last time that leaders of the North and South would march together. The next year, the South succeeded, and senators who had walked shoulder to shoulder here parted to become military officers and political leaders of the Union and the Confederacy. This old chamber that they left behind is not just a smaller version of the current chamber. Here, the center aisle divides the two parties, but there are an equal number of desks on either side. You will count 32 on one side and 32 on the other, not because the two parties were evenly divided, but because there was not room to move desks back and forth, depending on the size of the majority, as we do today. That meant that some members of the majority party had to sit with members of the minority. It did not matter to them. The two desks in the front row and the center aisle were not reserved for majority and minority leaders as they are now, because there were no party floor leaders at that time. No senator spoke for his party. Every senator spoke for himself. There were recognized leaders among the senators, but only unofficially. Everyone knew, for example, that Henry Clay led the Whigs, but he would never claim that honor. Clay generally sat in the last row at the far end of the chamber, so I could talk to senators as they came in to vote. The Senate left this chamber because it outgrew the space. When they first met here in 1810, there were 32 senators. So many states were added over the next 4 decades that when they left in 1859, there were 64 senators. Yet, while the Senate increased in size, it was essentially the same institution that the founders had created in the Constitution. Today, another century and 4 decades later, and having grown to 100 senators, it is still essentially the same institution. The actors have changed, the issues have changed, but the Senate, which emerged from the great compromise of July 16, 1787, remains the great forum of the states. This is so largely because, as a nation, we were fortunate to have wise, cautious people draft and implement our Constitution. They were pragmatists rather than idealists. James Madison, particularly, had a shrewd view of human nature. He did not believe in man's perfectibility. He assumed that those who achieved power would always try to amass more power, and that political factions would always compete out of self-interest. In the Federalist Papers, Madison reasoned that in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this: you must first enable the government to control the government, and in the next place oblige it to control itself. Madison and other framers of the Constitution divided power so that no one person, no single branch of government could gain complete power. As Madison explained it, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. However, ambition has not always counteracted ambition, as we saw in the enactment by Congress of the line item veto in 1996. Just as the Roman Senate ceded its power over the purse to the Roman dictators, Sulla and Caesar, and to the later emperors, thus surrendering its power to check tyranny, so did the American Congress, the Senate included. By passing the Line Item Veto Act, the Congress surrendered its control over the purse, control which had been vested by the Founding Fathers here in this legislative branch. This brings me to the first point I would like to leave you with this evening. It is this: the legislative branch must be eternally vigilant over the powers and authorities vested in it by the Constitution. Eternally vigilant. This is vitally important to the security of our constitutional system of checks and balances and separations of power. George Washington, in his farewell address of September 17, 1796, emphasized the importance of such vigilance. It is important, likewise, that the habits of thinking in a free country should inspire caution in those entrusted with its administration to confine themselves within their respective constitutional spheres, avoiding in the exercise of the powers of one department to encroach upon another. The spirit of encroachment tends to consolidate the powers of all the departments in one, and thus to create, whatever the form of government, a real despotism. The necessity of reciprocal checks in the exercise of political power by dividing and distributing it into different depositories and constituting each the guardian of the public weal against invasions of the others has been evinced by experiments, ancient and modern. To preserve them must be as necessary as to institute them. Each member of this body must be ever mindful of the fundamental duty to uphold the institutional prerogatives of the Senate if we are to preserve the vital balance which Washington so eloquently endorsed. Senator Byrd continues, during my 46 years in Congress, and particularly in more recent years, I have seen an inclination, I think I have, on the part of many legislators in both parties to regard a chief executive in a role more elevated than the framers of the Constitution intended. We, as legislators, have a responsibility to work with the chief executive, but it is intended to be a two-way street. The framers did not envision the office of president as having the attributes of royalty. We must recognize the heavy burden that any president bears. And wherever and whenever we can, we must cooperate with the chief executive in the interest of all the people. But let us keep in mind Madison's admonition. We must cooperate with the chief executive in the interest of all the people. But as majority leader in the Senate during the Carter years, I worked hard to help President Carter enact his programs. But I publicly stated that I was not a president's man. I was a Senate man. For example, in July 1977, I opposed President Carter's plan to sell the AWACS, that's the Airborne Warning and Control System, to Iran. Iran was then a military ally of the United States, but I was troubled over the potential security risks involved and the possibility of compromising highly sophisticated technology in this volatile region. I was concerned that the sale ran contrary to our national interests in maintaining a stable military balance and limited arms proliferation in the Middle East. Both houses of Congress had to vote disapproval resolutions to stop the sale. I enlisted the support of then Republican Minority Leader Howard Baker. Senator Baker was someone who could rise above the political party when he believed it was in the national interest required it, just as he did during the Panama Canal debates. The Carter administration chose to withdraw the sale of AWACS temporarily, and shortly afterwards, the Iranian Revolution occurred and the Shah was replaced. Had that sale gone through as planned, those sophisticated aircraft would have fallen into the hands of an unfriendly government. As so often has happened in our history, individual courage and character again charted the course. I want to return to his point about Republican Minority Leader Howard Baker. It said Senator Baker was someone who could rise above political party when he believed the national interest required it, just as he did during the Panama Canal treaties. The debate over those treaties was intense because they were a valuable asset controlled by the United States. Many thought of them as a possession of the United States, and we were turning them over to Panama after a long period of negotiations. But to be able to rise above partisanship, to pursue the national interest, that's what we need now as we face the potential of this devastating change in Senate conduct over the selection of a Supreme Court nominee. I hope we can find a way to rise above partisanship or political party and pursue the national interest, because I've seen so little of the desire to strengthen our institutions. And so I'm not optimistic, but I do think it's worth noting that is possible. We could take this train off the tracks because of the shadow hanging over the presidency, because of the far-right views of Neil Gorsuch, because it's a stolen seat and we haven't remedied that situation with a plan. Senator Robert Byrd continued, saying, "This brings me to my second point. On the great issues, the Senate has always been blessed with senators who were able to rise above party and consider first and foremost the national interests. There are very worthy examples in Senate history. When I came to the Senate in 1959, artists were at work painting 5 porthole portraits in the Senate reception room. The Senate had appointed a special committee chaired by Senator John F. Kennedy to elect the 5 most significant senators in Senate history. This was no easy task because there were many potential candidates. In setting the criteria, the committee looked to senators who had stood firm for principle, who had not blown with the winds, and made personal sacrifices for the national good. They were not saints, nor firm for principle, who had not blown with the winds, and made personal sacrifices for the national good. They were not saints, nor were they perfect men. Yet he deserved to have his portrait in the Senate reception room, not simply as a great orator, but as a man who sacrificed his own political standing by endorsing the Compromise of 1850, which was deeply unpopular in his home state of Massachusetts, but which he realized was the best chance to hold this union together. In my almost 46 years in Congress, I have seen other courageous senators. I've already referred to the courage demonstrated by former Senator Howard Baker during the Panama Canal debates. Without Senator Baker's support, the Panama Canal treaties would never have been approved by the Senate. We needed 2/3. We were swimming uphill. The odds were against us. The killing of American servicemen in Panama would have gone on, but Senator Howard Baker threw his shoulder against the wheel and helped to construct what he and I referred to as leadership amendments, amendments which protected U.S. interests in that region. We both worked shoulder to shoulder against great odds, as indicated by the polls. We did so because we believed, after careful study, that the treaties were in the best interests of the United States. There are people in my own state of West Virginia who still don't believe that, but I was convinced. Howard Baker knew what my old majority leader, Mike Mansfield, and all students of the Senate's institutional role know. Political polarization, too much emphasis on which side of the aisle one sits, is not now and has never been a good thing for the Senate. I am talking about politics when it becomes gamesmanship, or when it becomes mean-spirited, or when it becomes overly manipulative simply to gain advantage. I'm not talking about honestly held views or differing political positions. These things enrich our system. Americans have always loved a good debate. And that is what I believe they wish for now, more substantive and stimulating debate and less pure politics and imagery. But I well understand history and its ebb and flow. And I well know that we live in an age of imagery. It is simply my wish that sometime soon, the rising tide of imagery and partisanship will begin to ebb rather than to flow quite so freely. Washington, in his farewell address, warned us against the baneful effects of the spirit of party when he said, "In governments purely elective, it is a spirit not to be encouraged. From their natural tendency, it is certain there will always be enough of that spirit for every salutary purpose, and there being constant danger of excess, the effort ought to be, by force of public opinion, to mitigate and arrange it. A fire not to be quenched. It demands a uniform vigilance to prevent its bursting into a flame, lest increasing, instead of warming, it should consume." So I believe that the American people are more than tired of partisan warfare. I believe they wish for less of it from Congress, especially in the Senate, where more statesmanship and a longer view are expected. Declining participation in elections, repeated public surveys which indicate weariness, distrust, alienation within our system ought to serve as a harbinger to be ignored at our own peril. It must be a matter of concern to all of us that all too few Americans look to office holders for inspiration in these troubled and turbulent times. How can we attract the talent needed to serve in public office in future years if elected officials continue to be held in such low esteem? I would very much like to see a rekindling of basic faith in our leaders, continuing to read Byrd's speech in the old Senate chamber. I would very much like to see a rekindling of basic faith in our leaders and a renewal of interest in politics and public service. But the existence of inspiring leadership by public officials is fundamental to shoring up of that faith. In fact, I think the American people are in desperate need of some old-fashioned heroes. Now it seems today's heroes, if we want to loosely use the term, are merely celebrities, rock stars who sprout deplorable messages, or sports figures who amass fortunes advertising baggy clothes at exorbitant prices. Well, I'm not talking about Sammy Sosa. I'm not talking about Mark McGwire. They are my heroes too, as was Babe Ruth in 1927. Not much to look up to here, I say, not much to build dreams on. Look hard at the content of our popular culture. There really is nothing to inspire and look up to, and regrettably, there's also not much to counter the empty commercialism which is so prevalent it has become the norm. So, Senator Byrd, the norm. So, Senator Byrd continued, where are we in all of this? Representing the people, play while we simultaneously endeavor to carry out our 200-year-old mandate, bequeathed to us by some of the most brilliant men of their age, or of any age, before or since. While we can show up for our roll call votes, carry out our committee assignments, issue the obligatory. While we can show up for our roll call votes, carry out our committee assignments, All of these are necessary and to a greater or lesser degree important. But a reemphasis by the Senate on our strict institutional role is certainly something which I would like to see. It is a sobering and heavy responsibility all by itself, and its very weightedness tends to cool the overheated passions of political demagoguery. After all, that role is, in a constitutional sense, the reason we are here. The framers expected a zealous defense of our powers to keep the tyrants at bay. But there is still another role, an intangible something, that we who are privileged to sit in this body, and indeed leaders in the private sector, as well as those who write and reflect upon our news, are called upon to play. I call it the duty beyond our duties. The duty I am talking about is the duty to endeavor to inspire others and to demonstrate, through personal example, that public service of all types ought to be an honorable calling, contrary to what many believe is absolutely the wrong place for the slick and the insincere. Serving the public in a leadership role demands honesty, hard work, sacrifice, and dedication from those who dare to ask the people for such an awesome trust. Those who ask to shoulder that mantle also shoulder a much larger personal obligation than many of us may regularly contemplate. Mr. Leader, we all have a clear responsibility to serve as role models, to inspire our people, and particularly our young people, to be and to do their best. On that score, we politicians as a group generally miss the mark. Perhaps it's because power, whether it be the power of political office or the power to run giant corporations or the power to report and analyze events, is a very heady thing. It can lead to arrogance, self-aggrandizement, disregard for playing by the rules, and contempt for the people who send us here. It can lead us to forget that we are servants, not masters. Senator Byrd continued, in the real world, exemplary personal conduct can sometimes achieve much more than any political agenda. Comity, courtesy, charitable treatment of even our political opposites, combined with a concerted effort to not just occupy our offices, but to bring honor to them, will do more to inspire our people and restore their faith in us, their leaders, than millions of dollars of 30-second spots or glitzy puff pieces concocted by spin masters. These are troubling times for our nation and our people on both the national and international fronts. For our country to weather the rough seas ahead, we must use our most tempered judgment and seek out our best and most noble instincts. Our example here can be a healing element, a balm to salve the trauma of distrust and disillusionment too long endured by good people. Let each of us follow his or her own conscience when it comes to issues. But as we do so, may we be ever mindful that our people watching us and the people who sent us here can take us back home again. Let us be aware of the sublimely uplifting part which the examples of simple dignity, decency, decorum, and dedication to duty can play in the life of a nation. Senator Byrd had yet more words to share. Let us also remember that even after 200 years, the Senate is still the anchor of the Republic, the morning and evening star in the American constitutional constellation. It has had its giants and its little men, its Websters and its Bilbos, its Calhouns and its McCarthys. It has been the stage of high drama, of comedy and of tragedy, and its players have been the great and the near great, those who think they are great, and those who particularly never will be great. It has weathered the storms of adversity, withstood the barbs of cynics and the attacks of critics, and provided stability and strength to the nation during periods of civil strife and uncertainty, panics, and depressions. In war and in peace, it has been the sure refuge and protector of the rights of the states and of a political minority, because great and courageous senators have always been there to stay the course and keep the faith. And it can do so again, as long as we are ever blessed in this august body with those who hear the clear tones of the bell of duty. The Senate will continue to stand the great forum of the constitutional American liberty. That's a lot of good advice as we sit here in these troubled times and ponder how we're going to rise above the passions and politics of the moment to restore the functionality of the Senate. That is the challenge that we have. I believe that Byrd, with his experience and with his articulate language, is calling to us from the past to say, we can do it. We can do better. We can rise above the situation in which we have put ourselves. The situation in which one team, for the first time in U.S. history, has stolen a Supreme Court seat to pack the court. To be in the position now of considering a Senate nomination at the exact moment that the person making the nomination and their team, his team, are under investigation for potentially traitorous conduct against the United States, but we don't have the answers yet. Here we are with a judge appointed way outside the mainstream, and we have a challenge, therefore. It's exactly what the filibuster was designed for, was to keep there from being judges nominated from outside the judicial mainstream. So that's a lot for us to wrestle with in the next few days. The New Yorker did an analysis of where Neil Gorsuch lies. Why don't we put up that Twin Peaks chart again? Can you put up the Twin Peaks chart? The subtitle says, every sign suggests that it'd be at least as conservative a judicial activist as Samuel Alito. Now, this is a different source, but that's the same basic point, showing an analysis that places Neil Gorsuch to the right side of the right peak in terms of ideology. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the diminutive liberal colossus of the Supreme Court, has built a distinguished record as a jurist. But her legacy as a nominee is more dubious. In her confirmation hearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee in 1993, she refused to answer most questions about how, if confirmed, she would rule. In an oft-quoted phrase, she vowed to give no hints, no forecasts, no previews. Nominees have invoked this stonewall ever since. Last week, Neil Gorsuch, Donald Trump's choice to fill the seat of the late Antonin Scalia, proved an especially ardent follower of what has come to be known as the Ginsburg rule. Asked repeatedly by members of the committee about his views of such cases as Roe versus Wade and Citizens United, Gorsuch not only refused to answer, but went on to say that his feelings, if he had any, were of no consequence. It's not a matter of agreeing or disagreeing, he said. It's a matter of it being the law. And my job is to apply and enforce the law. Gorsuch portrayed himself as a kind of judicial automaton, obligated to pay mindless obeisance to the court's prior rulings. This interpretation of the role of Supreme Court justices is, to put it charitably, incorrect. They can and do overturn their earlier holdings. And Trump didn't nominate Gorsuch simply because he knows how to follow precedent. He nominated Gorsuch because his career resembles a lab experiment synthesizing every trend in modern conservative thought. A ruggedly handsome Coloradan, this president cares a great deal about appearances. Gorsuch has an appealing manner and an impressive resume. He did well in good schools, held prestigious clerkships, worked at a fine law firm, took a senior post in the Department of Justice, and for the past decade has served on the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. From his boyhood days as a Republican Senate page to his decades of volunteer work for GOP candidates, Gorsuch has been a strong party loyalist. Like many Republican polls, he refers to the Democrat rather than the Democratic Party. His background also includes a dose of pro-corporate, deregulatory libertarianism, as reflected in his close relationship with the billionaire Philip Anschutz, a client-turned-mentor. A sampling of authoritarianism can be seen in Gorsuch's service in George W. Bush's Justice Department, where he helped craft a proposal for the treatment of detainees at Guantanamo. The Supreme Court later ruled it unconstitutional. There's social conservatism, too, evident in his one book, A Critique of Death with Dignity Laws and Physician-Assisted Suicide. All human beings are intrinsically valuable, he wrote, and the intentional taking of human life by private persons is always wrong. It's easy to read the book as a coded attack on abortion rights. To the extent that Gorsuch said anything of substance at his hearing, he put himself across as a mainstream figure. He said he had participated in some 2,700 cases on the appeals court and voted with the majority in 99% of them. This proves only that most cases are routine. Even the Supreme Court issues unanimous rulings more than half the time. The hard cases are the ones that matter. It's reasonable to project how Gorsuch would vote in them. He would oppose abortion rights. Trump promised to appoint a pro-life justice. His predilection for employers over employees is such that it yielded a circuit court opinion of almost Gothic cruelty. When sub-zero temperatures cause a truck driver's trailer brakes to freeze, he pulled over to the side of the road. After waiting 3 hours for help, he began to lose feeling in his extremities. So he unhitched the cab from the trailer and drove to safety. His employer fired him for abandoning company property. The majority in the case called the dismissal wrong, but Gorsuch said the driver was in the wrong. As a justice, Gorsuch would embrace the deregulation of campaign finance symbolized by the Citizens United decision. He argued in an opinion that judges should elevate limits on political contributions using the same tough standards that they apply to racial discrimination. His most famous 10th Circuit decision had him taking a side in the culture wars. In Hobby Lobby stores versus Sebelius, he ruled that a multi-billion-dollar corporation could withhold federally guaranteed rights to birth control from thousands of female employees because of religious beliefs of the corporation's owners. His position was upheld 5-4 by the Supreme Court. In an embarrassing coincidence, on the second day of Gorsuch's testimony, the court unanimously rejected one of his holdings in the 10th Circuit, ruling that it denied adequate educational opportunities to students with disabilities. Every sign suggests that Gorsuch would be at least as conservative a judicial activist as Samuel Alito. It's also clear that Neil Gorsuch is not Merrick Garland. Gorsuch's nomination is inextricable from its shameful political context. When Scalia died, more than 11 months remained in Barack Obama's presidency. The Senate Republicans refused to give his nomination even a hearing. This departure from norms was all the more outrageous because a tactic was used to block a moderate. Republicans denied Obama his constitutional right in order to trade a justice who might have been less liberal with Stephen Breyer for one who might be as radical as Clarence Thomas. Such a turnabout seemed especially disturbing given the FBI and other agencies are now investigating the very legitimacy of the Trump presidency. Indeed, Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader in the Senate, has called for a delay in the Gorsuch vote until there is some clarity about the Trump camp's ties to Russia. Last week, he also promised to lead a filibuster against Gorsuch's nomination. But Republicans, in response, vowed to change the Senate rules to allow them to confirm the nominee by a simple majority. The court is, as political scientists like to say, a counter-majoritarian institution. The President and the members of Congress must answer to the voters. The justices who serve for life answer only to the commands of the Constitution. But in doing so, it's their duty to speak for those who lack political power. The Trump era has already meant trouble for these people, the poor, the sick, the dissenters, and the immigrants. And Gorsuch, for all his intellectual distinction, has shown scant regard for their concerns. There's little reason to believe that he would be as a justice either. The LA Times wrote a story titled, "Another judicial dirty trick from the Senate Republicans. One of 2016's most spectacular examples of government dysfunction was the U.S. Senate's outrageous refusal to consider President Obama's nomination of Judge Merrick Garland to replace late Antonin Scalia on the Supreme Court. That dereliction of duty by the Republican majority not only denied a sitting president his constitutional prerogative to fill vacancies in the court, so that the appointment would go instead to a hoped-for Republican successor. It has also prevented the court from resolving a handful of cases because of a 4-4 split, and probably discouraged justices from accepting other cases because of the possibility of a similar deadlock. Less well known is the fact that the Senate also failed to hold floor votes on 24 Obama nominees for lifetime federal judgeships, which had been cleared by the Senate Judiciary Committee. They are among 59 aspiring judicial appointees whose nominations will expire when the 114th Congress fades into history this month. Of the 24 nominees left stranded, 3 had been selected for federal appeals courts, 2 for U.S. Courts of International Trade, and 19 for federal district courts. Some of the nominees have been waiting for Senate action for months, including U.S. District Judge Lucy Koh, who was nominated to the San Francisco-based U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals by Obama in February and recommended by the committee in September. Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont, the ranking Democrat on the Judiciary Committee, accused Senate Republicans of setting a record for inaction on judicial nominations, whereas a Democratic-controlled Senate confirmed 68 of George W. Bush's judicial nominees in the last 2 years of his presidency. Only 22 nominees have been confirmed in the comparable period. Democrats note. Republicans counter by citing other statistics, such as the fact that Obama has had more judicial nominees confirmed overall than Bush did in his 2 terms, 329 to Bush's 326. It's also true that the Democratic-controlled Senate ended its business in 2008 without having confirmed 26 Bush judicial nominees. And both parties have a history of refusing to act on highly qualified judicial nominees proposed by a president of the other party. Yet Leahy's indictment is on point. As with Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell's stonewalling of the Garland nomination, the failure to act on these lower court nominations is extreme and inexcusable. Extreme and inexcusable. As we noted above, it represents extreme and inexcusable. As we noted above, to appoint judges by and with the advice and consent of the Senate. Sabotaging the exercise of that authority is offensive, not only because it undermines the Constitution, but because it perpetuates a partisan grudge match over the federal courts. It would be utterly understandable if Senate Democrats now retaliated by making it difficult for President-elect Donald Trump's to win confirmation for his judicial nominees, especially those slotted for seats that Obama had every right to fill. Democrats will be especially reluctant to support a Trump nominee to the Supreme Court, who likely would move the court to the right, after Republicans cheated Obama out of his opportunity to shape the court in a more liberal direction by appointing Garland. We recognize that the selection of federal judges is an inherently political process, one in which both presidents and members of the Senate consider not only a nominee's technical qualifications and legal philosophy, but also his or her ideology and party label. Even so, both parties need to eventually find a way back to a state of affairs in which a president, regardless of party, will receive prompt Senate consideration as judicial nominees and an affirmative vote if they are well qualified and not extreme in their philosophy, as we fear some Trump nominees might be. That should be the process, regardless of which party controls the Senate. That is important because denying qualified judicial nominees a vote harms the federal judiciary by denying it needed personnel and by telling lawyers who might aspire to the bench that their nominations could languish for months and ultimately perish, not because of any failing on their part, but because of partisan gamesmanship. And it isn't lawyers and judges who suffer. As White House counsel Neil Eggleston told the Washington Post, there is a real impact on real people. There are people and companies who are not having their cases heard because there are no judges around. Trump can make a significant gesture toward restoring a measure of normality to the confirmation process. He should resubmit the names of the nominees who received bipartisan support on the Judiciary Committee, but were left stranded because of the delaying tactics of his fellow Republicans. This article is by Paul Gordon, titled Gorsuch and the Senate GOP's Alternative Universe. But as I'm reading these articles, let's not forget the basics. Can you put back up the 9? The basics are 16 seats have become open on the court in the history of the United States of America. And each and every time up until last year, the Senate acted on the nominee put forward by the president. They confirmed on the nominee put forward by the president. The situation we had with Merrick Garland, where the vacancy occurred before the election and the nomination occurred before the election. For example, with Merrick Garland, the vacancy was in February, the nomination was in March. Not so different from the first name on this list with William Johnson. Under Jefferson, when the vacancy was in January, the nomination was in March. In each and every one of these cases, the cases that occurred where the vacancy was after the election, and the nomination obviously was after the election as well, the cases where the vacancy was before the election, but then the president waited to nominate until after the election, and those cases that are more like Merrick Garland, where both the vacancy and nomination occur beforehand. In virtually every case, well, actually, in every case, in all 15 cases preceding the death of Antonin Scalia, the Senate acted. Of those 15, they confirmed 11, and they defeated 4. And that brought us to last year, and as you can see on this chart, no action, first time in U.S. history. And it wasn't just an alternative way of doing things. It was a strategy to pack the court, to try to send the nomination into the future in the hopes that there would be a conservative president who would nominate a conservative member of the court. Well, I think most folks who were participating in this court-packing scheme didn't really think it would work, because it wouldn't have worked if Democrats won the presidency or gained control of the Senate, and they were considered at least to have a 50-50 shot at each. So it was a surprise to everyone that suddenly we're where we are. But there was no decision, even at that late date after the election. We could have had time to vet and vote on the nominee. There's a whole set of these nominations that occurred after the election. And so it would have been totally possible after the November election to go ahead and still at that point consider Merrick Garland. We wouldn't be in this deep, difficult hole right now had we done so. But we didn't, and it was a deliberate strategy to pack the court that is now on the verge of succeeding if we go through with the vote this week. And if the rules are changed, if the rules aren't changed, then we'll do what has been done over the decades. If your candidate doesn't have the votes, they get withdrawn. You change the candidate, you don't change the rules. The rule of 60 votes to close debate is designed to ensure that there's some bipartisan support for the nominees being put forward. Well, that's an important thing in terms of the integrity of the court. So we've got to resolve this stolen seat. And one way we could do that is to say, hey, we're going to put this on hold. We're going to put it on hold until the investigation is done with the president. And we're going to put it on hold until we have a second open seat. And at that point, Merrick Garland, the president could propose Merrick Garland for one of the seats, the first seat where he should have been duly considered to begin with, and a judge for the second seat that is more to his liking, off his list, if you will. That would get us out of this quagmire. That would protect the credibility of the Senate, and it would protect the legitimacy of the court. So this article Gorsuch and the Senate's GOP's alternate universe is by Paul Gordon. In their efforts to get the ultra-conservative Neil Gorsuch onto the Supreme Court, Senate Republicans have moved beyond creating alternative facts. They've created an entire alternative universe. If Gorsuch has earned so little bipartisan support that he cannot get the support of 60 senators, as all 6 successful nominees of the past 3 presidents were able to do, Mitch McConnell is threatening to change the Senate rules to allow Supreme Court nominees to be confirmed by party-line majority votes. He and his colleagues portrayed Judge Gorsuch as mainstream, the absence of consultation as bipartisanship, and themselves as victims of unprecedented and unprincipled partisan obstruction from the Democrats. Republicans don't want to trigger the nuclear option they claim through crocodile tears, but will have no choice but to do so if those mean Democrats insist on a 60-vote threshold. Listen to them. You'd think they were the injured party. You never know that Republicans refused to hold a hearing for Merrick Garland President Obama's nominee for this very vacancy. To justify this unprecedented move, they claimed that it had been decades since any president was permitted to immediately fill a vacancy that arose in a presidential election year. They were careful not to mention the reason for that. It's rare for justices to die in office, and Justice Scalia was the only justice since 1950 to pass away during an election year. The refusal to even consider Judge Garland for the Supreme Court was unprecedented, a pure power play that drew wide condemnation. Republicans insisted on a 60-vote threshold for 3 of President Obama's D.C. Circuit nominees, regardless of who they were, and even announced their demand before any nominations were made. They made it clear that they would block President Obama from filling any of the 3 vacancies on the 11-member court. It was this extreme, unprecedented, unprincipled, anti-democratic push that forced the Democrats to drop the 60-vote requirement for lower court nominees. Republicans defended the 60-vote margin during the Obama years as a safety mechanism to encourage presidents to consult with senators of the opposing party and select judicial nominees with bipartisan support. Conservatives claim that Democrats should support Gorsuch because his nomination was the culmination of the most transparent Supreme Court selection process in history, since Trump listed his potential nominees before the election. In fact, this may have been the least transparent selection process in history, designed to lead to an extremist nominee rather than one who could garner bipartisan support. Trump outsourced his Supreme Court selection to 2 of the most influential and well-funded right-wing ideological organizations in the country, the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation. Their selection process is the one that matters, and it was anything but transparent. What conversations did they have with Gorsuch that led them to include him on their list? When Senator Blumenthal asked Gorsuch if he'd had any conversations about Roe versus Wade or abortion in general with the Heritage Foundation, Gorsuch only said that no such conversations had occurred after the election, long after he'd been included on the list. We have seen transparent and bipartisan selection processes before, and they looked nothing like what we have seen with the current nomination. For instance, President Clinton consulted closely with Orrin Hatch, then the ranking Republican on the Judiciary Committee, before making his 2 Supreme Court nominations. And that consultation was genuine. Based on Senator Hatch's advice, Clinton passed over his original first choice, acting transparently and in a manner to encourage bipartisanship. Republicans can posture as a principled, wanted party forced to trigger the nuclear option, but that simply isn't reality. Since the death of Justice Scalia, indeed, since the moment President Obama took office, they have time and again escalated their partisan approach to the selection of judges. They held Obama's circuit court nominees to a 60-vote threshold, then refused to allow votes at all on 3 D.C. circuit vacancies, regardless of who they were, and then refused to even hold a hearing for a Supreme Court nominee. Senate Republicans did not enter this presidency with clean hands. And while much of the GOP obstruction since 2009 had nothing to do with the nominees, and while much of the GOP obstruction since 2009, Democrats have not said that they will oppose anyone who Trump nominates. In fact, as Senator Minority Leader Chuck Schumer has said numerous times, if Gorsuch cannot earn 60 votes, the solution is not to change the rules, but to change the nominee. It's clear that Senate Republicans have created an alternative universe worthy of a Star Trek episode. The Brennan Center for Justice published an article by Clara Torres Spelisi, Neil Gorsuch understands campaign finance, and that's the problem. It's Supreme Court prediction season, with 10th Circuit Judge Neil Gorsuch's nomination to fill the late Antonin Scalia's seat by President Trump or by whomever he outsourced the job. I'm looking at you, Federalist Society and Heritage Foundation. Now everyone, including me, is poring over his past decisions to see what they could mean for the laws most in flux before the Supreme Court. I've hunted for clues about what Gorsuch believes about money in politics. He presides at the 10th Circuit, which covers Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, Kansas, and Oklahoma. From a campaign finance perspective, most of the cases come from Colorado, which has tried to improve its campaign finance laws, both through statute and by amending the state constitution. Various aspects of the Colorado campaign finance laws have landed in the 10th Circuit, which is not known for being a particularly hospitable venue for reformers. One 2014 case called Riddle v. Hickenlooper had a concurrence written by Gorsuch. So what can we learn from this opinion about his style of judging, his views of campaign finance reform, and what he might do if he's elevated to the court? Riddle v. Hickenlooper involved 3 candidates vying for a seat in the Colorado House of Representatives. There were 2 major party candidates and 1 write-in candidate. Individual contributions to the Republican and Democratic candidates were capped at $400, while the limit for the write-in candidate was $200. The reasoning for the law was that major party candidates typically have to go through a primary where minor and write-in candidates do not. The write-in candidates sued, claiming that the lower cap was a violation of contributors' rights under the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. The district court dismissed the claim, saying that contribution restrictions were constitutional. But a 3-judge 10th Circuit panel consisting of 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat unanimously reversed the lower court, finding that the disparities in contribution limits were indeed a violation of the equal protection provision. Gorsuch took the time to write a separate concurring opinion. What's encouraging about Gorsuch's opinion is that he accurately discusses complex campaign law, and this takes time and skill. Trust me, I've read plenty of lower court opinions in campaign finance cases where the lower court judges can't follow the ins and outs of the exceptions to the exceptions in campaign finance law. These details do not stump Gorsuch. He writes thoughtfully, incisively about how the Supreme Court has been unclear about exactly which level of scrutiny applies to equal protection objections to differential campaign contributions. In the end, he concludes that whether the standard is strict scrutiny or intermediate scrutiny, the Colorado law cannot justify allowing major party candidates to raise twice as much as minor party candidates. Gorsuch also deserves credit for crafting his opinion narrowly and taking the time to note the limits of the case holding. As he wrote, "Having said this much, it is worth pausing to emphasize what isn't said in these pages. Nothing in what I've suggested or what the court holds intimates that Colorado must adopt a per-election cycle rather than a per-election approach to the regulation of campaign contributions. This limiting language appears to display sensitivity to the fact that Colorado has great latitude to choose its own means of election, administration, and campaign finance. This shows judicial incrementalism and a laudable degree of modesty. But there are a few words from Gorsuch's opinion which should give campaign finance reformers pause. For one, he wrote, quote, "No one before us disputes that the act of contributing to political campaigns implicates a basic constitutional freedom, one line at the foundation of a free society, enjoying a significant relationship to the right to speak and associate, both expressly protected First Amendment activities." In other words, Gorsuch is maintaining the link between political money and free speech. He added, "The plaintiffs before us don't complain that Colorado's contribution limits violate their First Amendment rights because, say, the limits are too low for everyone." This last quote is ambiguous. It's not clear whether there is an inadvertently missing word "they" before "say," which would mean he was attributing the statement to the plaintiffs in the case. But the way it is written sounds like Gorsuch himself is saying that contributions are too low for everyone. The limits at the issue were $400 for a major party candidate and $200 for a minor party and writing candidate. And if this is his true belief, it would demonstrate hostility to one of the basic pillars of campaign finance reform since Watergate, modest contribution limits. So the good news is Gorsuch can navigate his way through a tangle of precedent. A basic qualification for a jurist. The bad news is he may harbor antipathy to regulating money in politics. And if Gorsuch is elevated to the Supreme Court, he can help conservatives move the goalpost to strict scrutiny so that Colorado and other states' attempts to temper the role of money in politics will be far more difficult to justify in court. So let me return to where I started yesterday evening, which we are facing three very significant problems. The first problem is that for the first time in history, we are considering a nominee for a stolen Supreme Court seat. And that alone should be reason for everyone who cares about this institution to turn down this nominee and to convey to the president that the only legitimate nominee for this open seat is Merrick Garland, because as a Senate, we have a stake in the legitimacy of our work and that of the court. And to confirm anyone but Merrick Garland to this seat confirms the Senate as the thief who took the seat for the first time in U.S. history and transported to another president in an effort to pack the court. And furthermore, if there is a person confirmed to this seat other than Merrick Garland, it casts a shadow over every 5-4 decision that individual participates in the years to come. It destroys the public credibility of the position. It makes the Supreme Court simply into a political body to which clever campaign tactics have delivered a majority for one ideological vision over another. Let us not enter into that position of destroying the credibility of the Senate process and the integrity of the court in one fell swoop. And second of all, we should not be considering a nominee from a president who is under investigation for conspiring with Russia to change the outcome of an election. Now, we don't know under investigation for conspiring with Russia to change the outcome of an election, the legitimacy of him holding the office. Let us clear up that cloud. Let us answer the questions that have been raised. When a week ago Monday, FBI Director Comey came to Capitol Hill to talk to the House and say, yes, those investigations are underway. And we know what the diabolical practices of the Russians were. We know that they created fake news. We know that they had a team of roughly 1,000 people sending out contrived social media messages to comment on the events of the day to make it look like American citizens were commenting and to make one candidate look very good and the other candidate look very bad. And finally, this is an extreme nominee from the far right who doesn't believe in the fundamental vision of we the people and makes decision after decision through tortured, twisted, contrived arguments to find for the powerful over the people, and that is unacceptable. Thank you, Mr. President.
Under the previous order, the time until 11 a.m. will be controlled by the majority.
Mr. President.
The majority leader.
Neil Gorsuch is eminently qualified to serve on the Supreme Court. He was confirmed by the Senate to his federal judgeship with no Democratic opposition at all, none. He participated there in more than 2,700 cases, writing in the majority 99% of the time and enjoying unanimous support 97% of the time. He received the highest possible rating from a group the Democratic leader called the gold standard for evaluating judicial nominations, the American Bar Association. He's earned high praise from across the judicial nominations, the American Bar Association. He's earned high praise, his fairness, and his impartiality. He also enjoys the support of a bipartisan majority of the Senate. And yet, the Democratic leadership is now determined to block his confirmation with the first successful partisan filibuster of a Supreme Court nominee in American history. They proved that in yesterday's procedural vote. Judge Neil Gorsuch is one of the most impressive nominees we've ever seen. If a widely praised nominee like this can't get past the Democratic filibuster, then no nominee of a Republican president could. Democrats would filibuster Ruth Bader Ginsburg if President Trump nominated her. We all know why. The Democrats are bowing to hard-left special interests that can't get over the results of the election and thus are demanding complete Democratic opposition to everything this president touches. And as the Washington Post just reported, the Democratic leaders seem ready to endorse every argument the activists have made. It seems some Democrats made up their minds long ago to oppose whomever the president nominated. The Democratic leader himself indicated as much before Judge Gorsuch was even selected. He even mused on a liberal talk show about holding the seat open indefinitely. So it doesn't really matter who this president nominates. A Democratic minority is determined to successfully launch an unprecedented partisan filibuster regardless. Perhaps that's why Democrats still have yet to put forward a cogent rationale to oppose him. Not that that would be easy, you understand. As a longtime Democrat and board member of the left-leaning American Constitution Society put it, the Senate should confirm Judge Gorsuch because there is no principal reason to vote no. Well, if there's no principal reason to vote no on this nomination, then there's certainly no principal reason to prevent the Senate from taking a vote on it at all. But that's just what a partisan Democratic minority of the Senate is threatening to do for the first time in nearly 230-year history of the Senate. So let me remind colleagues of something I said yesterday. When President Clinton nominated Justice Ginsburg, I voted to confirm her. When President Clinton nominated Justice Breyer, I voted to confirm him. When President Obama nominated Justice Sotomayor and Justice Kagan, I led my party in working to ensure that they received an up or down vote. In other words, not a filibuster. I knew I would often disagree with their opinions on the court, and I certainly wasn't wrong about that, but I thought it was the right thing to do. I understand that our Democratic colleagues are currently under a great deal of pressure from special interests on the far left. I think everyone in elected office can empathize with the situation they're experiencing. Listening to these hard left special interests may seem like the politically expedient thing for Democrats to do for their party today, but I'd ask them to make their decision based on what they know is right for the country tomorrow. There's still time for them to make the right choice. There's still time for them to support a nominee who even longtime Democrats have praised, or at the very least, to not block him with the first successful partisan filibuster in American history. So I hope Democrats reevaluate their position before the important vote we'll take tomorrow. I hope they'll consider what their actions would mean for future Supreme Court confirmations. I hope they'll consider what their actions could mean for the future of this body more broadly. Because as we all know, the American people will be watching. History will record the decision Democrats make, and there's simply no principled reason to oppose this exceptional Supreme Court nominee.
Mr. President.
The senator from Iowa.
We're continuing to debate the nomination of Judge Gorsuch to serve as Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. My colleagues on both sides of the aisle have said that this is an important moment for the United States Senate. I couldn't agree more. I think it's important to reflect on why we're here and how we got here. Before I turn to the Supreme Court and the current debate, let me take just a few minutes to talk about lower court nominees and provide a little bit of history and context, especially for the benefit of some of the senators who weren't here over the last few years. I'm going to start way back in the spring of 2001. President George W. Bush had just been elected president. As we know, we all know, in fact, it was a close election, and it was hardly fought. The Senate was closely divided, with the Republicans in control. Given how close the presidential election was, there were elements of the hard left who refused to accept the results of that election. Some blamed Ralph Nader, others blamed Governor Jeb Bush, and still others blamed the Supreme Court. Many on the hard left claimed that President George W. Bush wasn't, quote unquote, a legitimate president. Liberal interest groups were egging on the Democratic leadership to fight the new president at every turn. Now, that still sounds very familiar for this year that we're in. At the same time, one major concern for the hard left liberal interest groups was that President Bush, whom they claimed wasn't legitimate, would be able to nominate conservative judges. Again, doesn't that sound familiar? Senator Cornyn, judges. Again, doesn't that sound familiar? Senator Cornyn, discussion now, and it deserves as a reminder where we've been before, because sometimes the past predicts the future. So in the spring 2001, the hard left interest groups went to the Senate Democratic leadership with a plan. According to the New York Times, 42 of the Senate, and this is a quotation, 42 of the Senate's 50 Democrats attended a private retreat where a principal topic was forging a unified party strategy to combat the White House on judicial nominees, end quote. Thinking about 2017, doesn't that sound a little familiar? At that meeting, Cass Sunstein, Marsha Greenberger, and Lawrence Tribe spoke at the retreat and pitched to the Democrats present there, their idea of how this crusade could proceed. One to attend, I quote, according to one attendee, and I want to quote, they said it was important for the Senate to change the ground rules, and there was no obligation to confirm someone just because they're scholarly and erudite, end of quote. Well, let's think about that for a moment. Why do you suppose they believe they needed to change the ground rules for? Why do you suppose they believe they needed to change the ground rules? Filibuster judges. You just didn't, and you heard the minority or the majority leader just speak to that point in his short remarks this morning about how things have changed after more than 200 years. Well, as it happened, less than a month after the caucus retreat, Senator Jeffords from Vermont switched parties and began caucusing with the Democrats. That threw the majority to the Democrats for the next 18 months. And then they lost the election of 2002, and in the spring of 2003, Republicans were back in the majority. Now, back in the minority, Senate Democrats went ahead with plans that were enunciated at that retreat to change the ground rules. For the first time in the history of the Senate, they began to systematically filibuster circuit court nominees, not because they believed the nominees weren't qualified, because these nominees were qualified, not because they believed those nominees didn't have the necessary experience, because these nominees did have the necessary experience. They filibustered those nominees because they believed that they were conservative judges. So with respect to appellate court nominees, Senate Democrats, at the behest of the far left, took the unprecedented step of using the filibuster in a very systematic way for the first time in Senate history. At the time, there was a lot of debate about changing the rules, dubbed the so-called nuclear option, so that nominees would be afforded an up or down vote consistent with Senate history and practice. Well, Republicans exercised restraint and agreed to step back. Then President Obama became president. Our side didn't like the use of the filibuster for judges, but we also didn't think there should be two sets of rules, one for a Republican president and one for a Democratic president. Common sense tells you that that's a legitimate position to take. We defeated two circuit court nominees, one to the Ninth Circuit and one to the D.C. Circuit. Then President Obama nominated three individuals to the D.C. Circuit. One side denied cloture. Our side denied cloture on these three nominees to the D.C. Circuit. Well, at that point, their side didn't like playing by the rules that they wrote. So Majority Leader Reid, then Majority Leader Reid, took another unprecedented step. In November 2013, he utilized the so-called nuclear option to eliminate the very tactics that they pioneered. So nuclear option becomes effectively the Reid rule. So that's how the filibuster was first used on lower court nominees and later eliminated. Senate Democrats took the unprecedented step to utilize that. And then when it no longer benefited them, they used unprecedented means to eliminate it. So this brings me back to where we are today and the rest of this week, to talking about a Supreme Court nominee, Judge Gorsuch. Everyone knows that we had a big debate last year about whether to proceed with a Garland nomination. There were 52 Republicans who believed that we should follow Senate history and tradition and not proceed with a nomination in the middle of a heated election year. And I know it frustrates my colleagues to hear me say it, but the fact of the matter is that in 1992, when then Senator Biden was chairman of the Judiciary Committee, he announced that he wouldn't hold a hearing to fill a vacancy in the last year of President Bush's term. So last year, we followed the precedent that Senator he discussed. And you get back to this common sense principle. Can you have one rule for Republican presidents and another rule for Democratic presidents? We didn't feel you could. And of course, everyone in this chamber knows that if the shoes were on the other foot, the Democrats, and of course, everyone in this chamber knows that if the shoes were on the other foot, the Obama's former White House counsel admitted as much. She said she would have recommended the same course of action if the tables were turned. So now, here we are, April 2017, with the nominee before us. Just like in 2001, we had just had a very contentious presidential election. Some on the hard left refused to accept the results of the election. Once again, left-wing groups are egging on the minority leader to take another unprecedented step with respect to judicial nominations. Only this time, they want him to lead the very first partisan filibuster of a Supreme Court nomination in United States history. And based on the vote we had yesterday, it appears that 44 Democrats are prepared to follow the minority leader on this fool's errand. No Supreme Court nomination in our country's entire history has ever failed because of a partisan filibuster. There's no getting around that fact. Abe Fortas, they might refer to, was subjected to a bipartisan filibuster over ethical concerns when President Johnson tried to elevate him to be Chief Justice. Now, Justice Thomas was confirmed by a vote of 52 to 48. I was here for that nomination. A single senator, any senator, could have demanded a cloture vote. But out of 100 senators, none did that. Why? For a simple common sense fact and 200 years of history. You don't filibuster Supreme Court nominations. But today is entirely different. The minority is committed to filibustering this fine nominee, the first partisan filibuster in U.S. history. So here we are. The president has nominated an exceptionally qualified judge to take Judge Scalia's seat on the Supreme Court. And the Democrats will break new ground again by conducting a partisan filibuster of that nominee. Republicans aren't the ones breaking new ground here. As a matter of fact, the Democrats' own vice presidential nominee last year emphatically promised that the Democrats would further change the rules to make sure and expected President Clinton's nominees couldn't be filibustered. So at the end of the day, the fact is that if Democrats insist on a filibuster, Republicans will insist on following the practice that senators have followed for more than 200 years, and that is not to filibuster, have a partisan filibuster for somebody going to the Supreme Court. We don't conduct partisan filibusters of Supreme Court nominees, and we're certainly not going to start with this highly qualified nominee. And I hope those that think back 16, 17 years when this meeting of Democrats in retreat came to the conclusion you had to break new ground, that they realize that that has poisoned the well of the comity traditional of the United States Senate. And I think maybe a lot of them realize that was a mistake, as we realize that that's a mistake. And it'd be nice to get back to the comity of the Senate that existed on judges prior to 15 or 16 years ago. But that's going to take people on their side who were present at that same retreat, who are still in the United States Senate, to drill a new well, because the present one is poisoned. And we need to get back to the comity that we've had. I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The first quorum call in the Senate this morning, Oregon Democrat Senator Jeff Merkley had been on the floor for, since 6:45 yesterday on the opposition to President Trump's Supreme Court nominee, Judge Neil Gorsuch. He spoke for just over 15 hours. It started 6:45 Eastern yesterday, lasted until about 10:15 this morning. The only break Senator Merkley took was when he entered into a brief colloquy with Minority Whip Dick Durbin, and that happened several hours ago. Formal debate on the Gorsuch nomination started with a vote yesterday where all Republicans who were present, along with 4 Democrats, voted in favor of moving forward with the debate. Those Democrats, by the way, Michael Bennet of Colorado, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, Heidi Heitkamp of North Dakota, and Senator Joe Donnelly of Indiana. And that will set up a vote tomorrow to limit debate and the likely final vote to approve Judge Gorsuch on Friday. By the way, you can watch all of the Senate proceedings on the Gorsuch nomination this week live here on C-SPAN 2 and at cspan.org. You can also listen live on your smartphone with the C-SPAN radio app, and you can watch what you missed at cspan.org. Type Neil Gorsuch nomination in the search bar. Senate, by the way, currently still in Tuesday's session, and that's likely to change here shortly as the Senate will gavel in Wednesday's session. Live coverage of the Senate here on C-SPAN 2. The pending business in the Senate continues to be the nomination of Colorado Appeals Court Judge Neil Gorsuch, President Trump's nominee to replace the late Antonin Scalia.
Mr. President.
The senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I come to the floor today.
Senate is in a quorum call.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, as I come to the floor today, we are at a decisive and a consequential moment here in the Senate. We're here to consider the nomination of Judge Neil Gorsuch to be a justice of the United States Supreme Court. Will Democrat senators vote to have a well-qualified mainstream justice who stands for the rule of law? Or will the extreme left wing of that party continue to try to call the shots? That's the decision members are going to have to make. America needs judges who can follow the law, who apply the law, who will have the highest ethical standards, who value the independence of our courts. To me, that's a description of Judge Gorsuch. That's him in a nutshell. We saw it throughout his career, and we saw it again at his confirmation hearings in the Judiciary Committee. Democrats on the committee asked him to answer hypothetical questions. Hypothetical questions. They asked him about issues that are probably going to be coming before the Supreme Court of the land. Now, there are ethics rules that say that judges and nominees cannot answer those kinds of questions. And of course, Judge Gorsuch followed the rules. That's exactly what other nominees have done in the past. Nominees who were nominated by Republican presidents, nominees who were nominated by Democrat presidents. It's what Ruth Bader Ginsburg did at her confirmation hearing in 1993. She said, quote, "A judge sworn to decide impartially can offer no forecasts, no hints." She said this would display disdain for the entire judicial process. And of course, she was confirmed, sits on the court today. It's been known as the Ginsburg Standard. This would display disdain for the entire judicial process. And of course, she was confirmed. Tried to criticize Judge Gorsuch for some of his opinions that they didn't like. They talked about a couple of cases where the person who was on the losing side in a case was sympathetic. They suggested that the court should have ignored the law and sided with, quote, the little guy in the involved cases. Well, Judge Gorsuch pointed out that judges are absolutely not supposed to consider what they think is sympathetic. They're supposed to rule based on the law. Federal judges actually swear an oath to administer justice without respect to persons and do equal right to the poor and to the rich. Most senators recognize that judges should be impartial. Now, the minority leader, Senator Schumer, has actually spoken about how important this is. At the confirmation hearing for Justice Sonia Sotomayor in 2009, she was nominated by President Obama. Senator Schumer praised the way that she put, quote, the rule of law above everything else. He said that she followed the texts of statutes. Even when doing so, he said, results in rulings that go against so-called sympathetic litigants. That was 2009. Now it's 2017. And that's the identical standard that Judge Gorsuch has continued to follow. Judge Gorsuch pointed out that it's his job to apply the law, not to write the law. Writing laws is the job of Congress. We're not here to select the 101st senator. We're here to select a justice for the Supreme Court. We're selecting a judge for the most important court in the land. And it's important and imperative that we take this decision seriously and that we set aside any partisan grudges. Democrats who want to filibuster this judge are not arguing any principle here. Reasonable individuals know that this nominee deserves to be confirmed. Now, there was one lawyer who wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post, March 8th. Now, he's a board member of the very liberal American Constitution Society. He wrote that there is no principled reason to vote against Judge Gorsuch. Well, he's exactly right. I listened to the arguments that Democrats have made in the confirmation hearing. I was not convinced. If any of my colleagues on the Democrat side of the aisle are undecided about how to vote, I suggest they go back and look and listen to the hearings as well. And look at what other people have said about this nominee. A Chicago Tribune editorial said that confirmation hearing revealed unassailable assurances by Gorsuch that he would decide each case on the merits, based on the law as written, applied to the world as it is today. The Detroit News agreed. It said that Justice Gorsuch showed that he is a, quote, deeply knowledgeable nominee who should be confirmed by the Senate. USA Today on Monday had their own headline. It said, on the merits, Gorsuch merits confirmation. The American Bar Association surveyed 5,000 people who've worked with Judge Gorsuch over the years. These people described him using words like brilliant, thoughtful, and, quote, really, really, really smart. close quote. The Bar Association also found Judge Gorsuch believes strongly in the independence of the judiciary. They predicted, this is the Bar Association, the American Bar Association, predicted that he will be a strong but respectful voice in protecting it. The group ended up giving him its highest possible rating. Now, interestingly, Senator Schumer once called this group, quote, the gold standard for evaluating judges. The gold standard, he called it. And they have given him their highest possible rating. So why does the minority leader think that the gold standard is not good enough anymore? Judge Gorsuch is even introduced at his confirmation hearing by a former top lawyer from the Obama administration. Neil Katyal is a Democrat. He served as Solicitor General of the United States under President Obama. He called Judge Gorsuch one of the most thoughtful and brilliant judges to have served our nation over the last century. Let me repeat. This is someone who has served as Solicitor General of the United States under President Obama, calling Judge Gorsuch one of the most thoughtful and brilliant judges to have served our nation over the last century. He even wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that predicted that Judge Gorsuch would, quote, help to restore confidence. Help to restore confidence in the rule of law. Isn't that what we want? I mean, as a nation, confidence in the rule of law. You know, I think that any Democrat who has looked at this nominee's record is going to find it's an easy decision to confirm him. If there's a Democrat who reaches the opposite conclusion, I say come to the floor of the United States Senate. Explain why you think our judges should go into a case favoring one side over another because one side is more sympathetic than the other. If there is a member who thinks that a judge should make promises about how they'll rule just to win a confirmation vote of a given senator, I would say come to the floor and make your case. If there is a member who thinks a justice of the Supreme Court should rule based on that justice's or her own preferences and not based on the law, I would say please come to the floor of the United States Senate and state it so. I don't think that's what the American people want. The American people do want justices who are smart. They want them who are principled, who are fair, and who know that their job is to follow the law, not to write the law, not to legislate from the bench. The American people know that Neil Gorsuch is exactly that kind of judge. It's the kind of judge we should have on the Supreme Court, we need on the Supreme Court, and we need on every court in the land. And that's why, Mr. President, I am committed to vote to confirm Neil Gorsuch to serve on the United States Supreme Court. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. Note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The Senate's focus for the rest of the day and likely for the rest of the week will be on the nomination of Neil Gorsuch. A vote on approval is expected on Friday. The beginning of the debate over Judge Gorsuch happened yesterday afternoon with Senate Judiciary Committee Chair Chuck Grassley. Here's a look.
Senator from Iowa.
Before I start, I ask unanimous consent that the debate time on the nomination of Judge Gorsuch during Tuesday's session of the Senate be divided as follows. The time until 3:30 under the control of the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. The time from 3:30 until 4:30 to be under the control of the minority. The time from 4:30 to 5:30 be under the control of the majority. 5:30 to 6:30 under the control of the minority. And finally, the control from 6:30 to 6:45 be under to 6:30 under the control of the minority. And finally, the control from 6:30 to 6:45 be under the control of the majority. We'll continue to debate the nomination of Judge Neil M. Gorsuch to serve as Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. The Judiciary Committee held 4 full days of hearings to serve as Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. He answered more than 1,000 questions during his testimony and hundreds more questions for the record. We've had the opportunity to review 2,700 cases that he's heard, and we've had the opportunity to review the more than 180,000 pages of documents produced by the Bush Library and the Department of Justice. Now, after all of this produced by the Bush Library and the Department of Justice, committed to what they've been talking about for a long period of time, filibustering the nomination of this very well-qualified jurist. Even after all this process, there's no attack against the judge that sticks. In fact, it's been clear since before the judge was nominated that some members in the Democratic leadership would search desperately for a reason to oppose him. As the minority leader said before the nomination, and I quote him, "It's hard for me to imagine a nominee that Donald Trump would choose that would get Republican support that we could support," end of quote from the minority leader. He said later, and I continue to quote him, "If the nominee is out of the mainstream, we'll do our best to hold the seat open," end of quote. But then the president nominated Judge Gorsuch. This judge is eminently qualified to fill Justice Scalia's seat on the Supreme Court, and there's no denying that whatsoever. So let me tell you something about him. A graduate of Columbia University and Harvard Law School, he earned a doctorate in philosophy from Oxford University and served as a law clerk for 2 Supreme Court justices. During a decade in private practice, he earned a reputation as a distinguished lawyer and appellate judge, both trial and appellate judge. He served with distinction in the Department of Justice. He was confirmed to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals by this body unanimously, voice vote. And the records he's built during his decade on the bench has earned him the universal respect of his colleagues, both on the bench and the bar. This judge is eminently qualified to do what the president appointed him to do. Now, faced with an unquestionably qualified nominee, My friends on the other side of the aisle, my Democrat colleagues, have continually moved the goalposts, setting test after test for this judge to meet. But you know what? This judge has passed all of those tests, all with flying colors. So, the people on the other side of the aisle, our Democratic majority, are left with a no vote in search of a reason. So let's go through some of their arguments. First, the minority leader announced that the nominee must prove himself to be a mainstream judge. Now, is he a mainstream judge or not? Well, you consider his record. Judge Gorsuch has heard 2,700 cases, written 240 published opinions. He's voted with the majority in 99% of the cases, and 97% of the cases that he's heard have been decided unanimously. Only one of those 2,700 cases was ever reversed by the Supreme Court, and it happens that Judge Gorsuch did not write the opinion. Then consider what others say about him. He's been endorsed by prominent Democratic members of the Supreme Court bar, including Neil Katyal, President Obama's acting Solicitor General. This acting Solicitor General wrote a New York Times op-ed entitled, quote unquote, "Why Liberals Should Back Neil Gorsuch." Mr. Katyal wrote, quote, "I have no doubt that if confirmed, Judge Gorsuch would help to restore confidence in the rule of law." End of that quote. He went on to write that the judge's record, quote, "should give the American people confidence that he will not compromise principle to favor the president who appointed him," end of quote. There's another well-known person, likewise David Frederick, board member of the Liberal American Constitution Society, says we should, quote, "applaud such independence of mind and spirit in a Supreme Court nominee," end of quote. So, after hearing both what people on the right and the left have said about the judge, he is mainstream. But the goalpost seems to move. Next, we hear that the judge doesn't care about the little guy and instead rules for the big guy. Now, first of all, that's a goofy argument. Just as liberal law professor Noah Feldman, he says, if you ask Professor Feldman, he says, this criticism is a, quote unquote, truly terrible idea because, continuing to quote, "the rule of law isn't liberal or conservative, and it should not be," end of quote. The strategy on this point became clear during our hearing. Pour through 2,700 cases, cherry pick a couple where sympathetic plaintiffs were on the losing end of the legal argument, and then find a reason to attack the judge for that result, and then because of that case or two, label him, quote unquote, against the little guy. Now, as silly as that argument is, the judge himself laid out laid waste to that argument during the hearing.
Request that proceedings under the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, like several in this chamber, I was asked for my input to the President on whom to nominate to the United States Supreme Court. And after much reflection, I recommended to the Vice President that Judge Neil Gorsuch of Denver, Colorado, should fill the Scalia seat on the Supreme Court. And I am, of course, very pleased that my advice was considered. And, Mr. President, I offered that recommendation before I had an opportunity to sit down one-on-one with Judge Gorsuch, though, in fairness, we had had an opportunity here in the Senate to review Judge Gorsuch and his credentials before. Back in 2006, when this body voted to confirm him by voice vote to the U.S. Court of Appeals, where he now sits. But after spending time with this exceptionally talented jurist and after reviewing his performance before the Senate Judiciary Committee, my level of respect for him has only grown. Judge Gorsuch checks the box on every measure of what I'm looking for in a Supreme Court nominee: intellectual capacity, experience, independence, integrity. He has all of these. There is no question that he has the intellectual capacity to meet the challenge. Yes, we acknowledge he's an Ivy League graduate from Columbia and Harvard Law, but that actually describes many people at the top of the legal profession, but that alone is not what makes Judge Gorsuch exceptional. Judge Gorsuch did something that most practicing lawyers don't do. He went on to earn a doctorate in legal philosophy at Oxford. So I think this is just one of the many illustrations of Judge Gorsuch's tremendous depth. And whatever else my colleagues will have to say about Judge Gorsuch in this contentious confirmation debate, there is no question but that he is an intellectual heavyweight. So I next look to those who mentored Judge Gorsuch along the way. And you really cannot have better mentors than the late Justice Byron White and sitting Justice Anthony Kennedy. Justice Kennedy, we all know, has carved a niche for himself as the swing vote on the Supreme Court. So there's a great deal of debate out there about whether a Justice Gorsuch will be more of a Scalia than a Kennedy or a White, or whether instead he will be a Gorsuch. I suspect, Mr. President, that he will be a Gorsuch, and that's just fine by me. What really matters is that Judge Gorsuch will come to the Supreme Court with a strong understanding of its dynamics. And there is no question that he will be effective from day one. No question but that he will be his own man. And I want to emphasize that point. Judge Gorsuch made it very clear to me when we met that he has made no commitments to the president or his team, and he made it clear at the hearings that if any commitment were sought, he would have gotten up and walked out. After spending time with Judge Gorsuch, I believe him. I believe him on that. His commitment to an independent judiciary is resolute. And I think on this issue, he will not bend to political expedience, as he should not. He is not the president's man, not the party's man, nor will he represent an ideological movement on the court. Judge Gorsuch will be his own man, following the law where it leads.